I was remembering this evening, just before I came in here to open this up, that when I was in grade five, six, 5 and 6, um, seven, maybe into seven, my Halloween costume used to be a devil costume, and it was basically one of these rubber heads, almost like it looked almost like hair, and then it had horns, and I had this red cape, and then my mother would put a sort of a snidely whiplash mustache, and I had a little goatee that she would paint on, and that was it. Oh, and I had a pitchfork. That's right, with a sort of a plastic, hollow plastic trident head, and then the pole part was made out of cardboard tube, and it was a very simple costume, but everyone knew what I was. Nobody said, "What are you supposed to be?" Everyone knew, "Oh, you're the devil." And it's because my costume was iconic. In other words, literally, it was an icon, a standardized image of some kind of spiritual or mythological being. And so everyone kind of recognizes it. So nowadays, when we see in a cartoon or in a movie or something, unless they're trying to sort of hide the devil character, if they're dressed in a stereotypical way, everyone knows right away which one is the devil. And if you look at this picture here that I've got up, this is a mural, a fresco from a church in Bolivia, actually, that was built in the early 1800s. And yet it has a very medieval feel to it, even though it's from the early 1800s. And this is hell, obviously, and well, I shouldn't say obviously, but we recognize it. This is the hell as it was portrayed through sort of the later Middle Ages, and then obviously into early modern times. The people are all naked. They have all their clothes taken off because, of course, they've all died, and they've been judged, lacking or wanting, and have been thrown into hell to be tormented by devils and demons and other horrible things. But of course, they're not really physical beings anymore, so they can't stop having the pain. It's at a spiritual, anyway. That's all the kind of mythology there. And you see at the top of the picture is the ruler of the underworld, the ruler of hell, Satan himself. There he is, and he's got his pitchfork, and he's got a cloak or wings. It's kind of hard to tell, and but he's recognizable. We know who that's supposed to be. It's not the green monster down on the bottom. That's something else. That's some other horrible creature. But it wasn't always like this. We see this and we say, "Oh, yeah, that must," at some point, a long time ago, this is just how it was, and it always was. But it wasn't. And it's remarkable how relatively recent this idea of hell and the devil is. And so that's what I want to explore today. So I'm going to have us go back in time to the ancient Israelites and the earliest layers of the Hebrew scriptures, and look at what we see there. So the oldest layers of the Hebrew scriptures, the theology or the system, the cosmic system or whatever, is something called henotheism. And henotheism is that each nation has its own gods, and Yahweh is the God of Israel. So Israel has one God, but that doesn't mean there's just one God. It just means that Israel has one God, and that's Israel's God, Yahweh, and others have other gods, multiple gods, or single gods, whatever they choose to do. And so I'm just giving an example of this kind of thinking expressed in a passage in Exodus 12:12. God, Yahweh, says to Moses, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt. I will execute judgment on all the gods of Egypt." So it's not that the gods of Egypt aren't, but the God of Israel at this point is executing judgment on those gods. And so that evolves very quickly into what I call, this is my term, enhanced henotheism, so that Israel's God is simply more powerful than others. And here's another quote where I forgot to put the reference and close it out there. Anyway, great is Yahweh, he is to be revered above all gods, for all the gods of the peoples are idols, but Yahweh made the heavens. So now Yahweh is the one who created everything, but there are these other gods out there. And then eventually this evolves into what we would recognize as monotheism. And this is kind of an extreme monotheism. God does all. I am Yahweh, there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I arm you, though you do not know me, so that they may know that there is no one beside me. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make weal and create woe. I, Yahweh, do all these things. So this is the kind of, I guess, theology, we could call it, that you also see in Islam today, which is where God is all powerful, all knowing, God does everything. And so really it's just about submitting to the will of God, because you really have no other choice. So inshallah, as God wills, or God willing, that's how it is. And this comes from, this is very old, this goes back to this kind of late, early layers of Israelite thinking. Now, the other thing that's notable is that before Satan and hell, there, or in this time period we're talking about, there was no afterlife in the early layers of the Hebrew Scriptures. The breath of life is given by God and returns to God. And so here's a quote from I forgot to put the reference anyway, from Genesis and then from Ecclesiastes. Yahweh God formed the human, the Ha'adam, the earth creature, from the dust of the ground, Ha'adamah, and breathed into its nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living being, a living nephesh. So, nephesh. The dust returns to the earth as it was, and the breath, Ha'ruach, returns to God who gave it. So that's the idea, that when you die, the body goes back to the earth, the ruach, the spirit, the breath goes back to God, and that's it, done. Death is final. There is, in death, there is no remembrance of you, and Sheol, who can give you praise, from Psalm 6. Mortals are like the animals that perish, Psalm 49. Then David slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. And you find many kind of references like this. And reward and punishment from God are in this life, or they are visited on future generations. And of course, the famous things about the commandments: if you obey the commandments, your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away, you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. And so it's very this worldly. God is the one who does everything. There aren't any devils or demons, or there's nothing like that. It's basically up to you to obey the commandments, and there are consequences for not obeying the commandments, and God's the one who meets them out in this life, or perhaps on your children or descendants. So now, of course, there are exceptions. This is not the Hebrew Scriptures are not a theology in any sense of the word, but rather they're different traditions, different ways of speaking about things that have been brought together, and sometimes they contradict each other, or they simply reflect two different traditions coming in there. And so you have to ask the question, well, what about the serpent in the garden in Genesis 3? Well, that's not the devil, that's not Satan, at least not in its original context. It's a standalone mythological or literary symbol or metaphor, and it's not linked to Satan until Revelation 20, verse 2, at the end of the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament put together, where it says the ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan. And that word serpent, you'll see being picked up later on in the Middle Ages by artists. Another example that seems to contradict this idea that, you die and that's it, is Saul, King Saul, using a medium to consult the spirit of the deceased Samuel in 1 Samuel 28. If you don't remember that, things are going poorly for Saul. He's desperate, and Samuel, the judge and prophet, has passed away, and that's the person he would turn to if he was in trouble. And so he goes to a medium, even though he's made it illegal to use mediums, and he asks her in the King James, I think she's called the Witch of Endor, and she's dubious, but she agrees to do it because he promises her she won't be punished for doing this, and she raises the spirit of Samuel from the dead, and of course, the spirit of Samuel is very angry that this has happened, and puts God's judgment on Saul for doing this. But anyway, this is an isolated incident. It's another example of Saul disobeying God, and why another example of why he's not suited to be God's anointed king. And this incident and the widespread worship of household gods that we see in archaeological digs from the late kingdom period in Israel corroborate that there were these other kind of folk customs and family religious cults and so on and so forth of little idols, and probably fertility idols or good luck idols or whatever, and so that's expressed in different places in the Hebrew scriptures as well. For example, 2 Kings 17, they served idols of which Yahweh had said to them, "You shall not do this," and it's just there, and it's very widespread, as we see in the archaeological evidence. So like I said, probably what we're seeing is the disconnect between the official thing that's going on in the temple and so on, and then just what's happening out among the people. Enters Satan, the accuser and tester, but not yet called the devil. And he's basically introduced, his character is introduced in Job as a member of the heavenly court. And in the Hebrew scriptures, there are 9 references to Satan. 8 of them are in Job. Job is probably a folk tale with its roots probably in the 6th century BCE, so before the Babylonian exile. It takes place in the land of Uz, which is possibly a fictionalized version of Edom or maybe of Upper Mesopotamia. An interesting little side note, when they translated the Wizard of Oz into modern Hebrew, they decided to call the land of Oz the land of Uz because it has this kind of semi-fictional quality to it from Job. The 9th reference to Satan in the Hebrew scriptures is in 1 Chronicles, a work of the 5th century, so post-exilic, so after the Babylonian exile. And that is the oldest evidence of the figure of Satan being picked up by another author, because otherwise it's just in Job. Satan's role in Job is to act as the prosecuting attorney against and tester of the faithful, right? So here's the little snippet out of the encounter between Satan and Yahweh. Then Satan answered Yahweh, "Skin for skin. All that people have, they will give to save their lives. but touch his bones and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. Then Yahweh said to Satan, very well, he is in your power, only spare his life. So Satan's role is to test, and that's what the name means. It means to test, or to test, or to prove, and that's Satan's role in Job. And doesn't appear anywhere else really, is mentioned in First Chronicles, but it doesn't figure really in the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. So what I want to do now is kind of go through some history very quickly with maps, because what I've described to you is Israelite religion in a time when Judah and Israel were kind of their own thing. It was a kind of a time of a power vacuum when Egypt and the major Mesopotamian powers were weak, and so Israel and Judah were able to exist in that power vacuum. But those times ended, and these big empires began to form. The one before this was obviously the Assyrian Empire, but in terms of the Bible, the important one is the Babylonian Empire. So you see here a map of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and you can see here, this is the land of Israel here. There's Jerusalem and Jericho, and they conquer this area. And because the Judahites resisted, and notice I say Judahites, Jews, that's where the word Jews comes from. It comes from the people of Judah, the Judahites. Because they resisted, Nebuchadnezzar comes down hard on them, takes away their leadership into exile, into Babylon, and for about 70 years or so, the leaders and the descendants of the leaders, so the priests, the whatever prophets there were, Ezekiel takes place in Babylon. The aristocracy, the scribes, the people, the skilled people of the city are all kind of taken away, and basically only the people of the country are left. So obviously there's some foreign influence that goes on there. This is also the time out of which comes the gathering together of the writings that form the core of the Hebrew scriptures. It's in this time, it's basically sort of a cultural salvage operation to try to preserve the traditions and the stories and the laws and the history and so on and so forth. So pretty much the Deuteronomic history, so from Genesis to the end to Second Kings, is from that time. And then of course the prophets. Most of the prophets deal with this time period. They either are just before it, warning that it's coming, or they are in it, or they are announcing the return, returning to Jerusalem. And so, for example, make straight God's paths and so on and so forth. That's all a reference to after the Neo-Babylonian Empire is conquered. Got to find my cursor there. Then we have the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, and so that's the dynasty, the Achaemenid dynasty. And that's this huge empire that just swallows up the Neo-Babylonian Empire and Egypt, and, well, of course, they're from here originally, Anatolia here and into Greece. And of course, we know them in our typical classical education. We know them from the Greek side of the story because they're the bad guys, right? Sparta and the 500 holding back the Persian army and so on and so forth. But from the experience of the Judahites, or the Jews, Persian rule was actually pretty good, and it was actually a pretty good time for them. And it was a time when these writings were being kind of smoothed out and so on and so forth. The book of Esther comes from this time, and yeah, anyway, that's this kind of editing is happening at this point, and they're allowed to kind of rule themselves, and as long as they pay taxes, the Persians are good. It's they rule a very light-handed rule, the Persians. But again, there is some influence coming, some intellectual influence, and the most notable things that begin to kind of move into Israelite or Jewish thinking, we begin to see dualism. that comes from Zoroastrianism. And in Zoroastrianism, there's the good Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, versus the evil Angra Mainyu, the evil spirit or mentality. And in the end, Ahura Mazda will triumph, but in our lives, this struggle is manifested in the struggle of good and evil within us. There are spiritual or heavenly beings. There's Ahura Mazda, of course, but Ahura Mazda becomes immanent in the world through the Amesha Spenta, so the bounteous or holy immortals, who in turn are assisted by the Azatas, which means those worthy of worship, often described as embodiments of virtue. So basically, we're seeing angels, right? The idea of these kind of heavenly beings who are doing stuff in the world, and that's not part of the old. There is a heavenly court, and God does send messengers, but the messengers in the Hebrew scriptures are, if you think about the three visitors to Abraham, or the angels or the messengers, the malachim, that's the Hebrew word for, we translate it as angel, that's from a Greek word actually, but it means a messenger. The messengers that come to Lot in Sodom, they're sort of anonymous. They don't have names, and they sort of come and go, and it's ambiguous whether they're physical or not physical. So here we begin to get the naming of heavenly beings and get more of a standard bureaucracy of the heavens developing here. So the Achaemenid Empire comes crashing down, is conquered by Alexander the Great. And one of the things I like to set straight is, we say Alexander the Great conquered the world. No, actually what he conquered was the Persian Empire. And so you can see it's almost the same. He basically conquered the Persian Empire, but he was from Macedon up here and had taken control of Greece, or his father had. So basically it's the Macedonians in Greece conquered the Persian Empire. And when he got to the eastern end of it, he went back to Babylon and died. And one wonders what would have happened if he'd lived longer. But he's immediately succeeded by his generals that we call the Diadochi. And so you can see here how they divide up his empire. So Seleucus gets the big chunk here, the yellow. Ptolemy gets Egypt, the next biggest chunk. And then I think this is Lysimachus or Lysander. I can't read it. It's too small. I need my glasses. Anyway, but these don't matter so much. These smaller bits, the homeland of Greece and Macedonia up here. And then on this map, they also note the Roman Republic up here, because of course, historically, they're looming on the horizon, but at this point, they're still a small power. So what's important about the Diadochi is, so remember, here's Israel. And on this map, you'll see that they have the Egyptian purple going up here, and then the Seleucid yellow coming in. It's because at the beginning of the period of the Alexander's successors, Israel, the land of Israel, was under Ptolemaic rule, under Egyptian rule. You may remember the Ptolemies from the last of the Ptolemies, which was Cleopatra. She was the last ruler of that dynasty before the Romans took over. But at a certain point, the Seleucids conquered this area from the Ptolemies, and that's when trouble begins. But what's important about this time is the influence of Hellenism. And this Greek culture kind of went out into what had been the Persian Empire, and it was a very attractive kind of culture. It was the modernity of the day. Beautiful art and beautiful architecture and philosophy and learning and all this kind of stuff. So the influences that come into the Hebraic religious world are religious syncretism, right? Elements in different religious systems are believed to be equivalent to each other, and so I have some examples. The high god of any local religion is basically Zeus. The local fertility goddess is basically Aphrodite. The local war god is basically Ares. So this also leads to the blending of local and Greek deities, such as the Alexandrian or Egyptian god Serapis, who is basically invented as kind of a melding together of Egyptian gods and Greek gods. The concept of Hades, a place where the dead go. So before the dead slept, they slept, but there wasn't a place. There was no locality where they went. The Greeks have the concept of Hades, a place where the dead go, governed by the god Hades. It's a place of darkness and forgetting, sort of like the Israelite sense of death or sleep, but some are rewarded there. Like the heroes and so on, they go to the Elysian fields, which is pretty nice. And those who have angered the gods are punished there, like Prometheus and Sisyphus and Tantalus in the lowest level, which is called Tartarus. And then, of course, the Greeks also bring philosophy, especially at this point, Middle Platonic philosophy, with such concepts as daemons, lesser spiritual intermediaries, similar to Zoroastrian yazatas, the idea of spiritual heavenly hierarchies, right? The heavens are in layers, and then they also bring the hermeneutics of ancient texts, so that hermeneutics of ancient texts. So interpreting ancient texts like the Iliad and the Odyssey or Plato, and then deriving, doctrines and abstract systems and so on and so forth from doing that. So that comes from the Greeks. So anyway, that period comes to an end, in a violent end, in the Maccabean revolt, where the traditionalists in Israel fight against the Hellenizers, and there's this civil war that goes on. The Hellenizers are wanting to make the temple in Jerusalem more like a Greek temple. They have built a theater in Jerusalem, a semicircular theater where they put on Greek plays, which are horrible and pagan and everything. And they want to be modern and they want to be with it. But the traditionalists want to preserve the Hebrew religion, the Hebrew way of doing things, and obey the laws and so on and so forth. And so there's this fighting that breaks out, this civil war, and the Maccabee brothers lead the traditionalist charge, and they throw off Seleucid rule, and they kick out the modernizers, the Hellenizers, and establish the Hasmonean dynasty. So this is just a map of how they gradually, just like kind of like modern Israel, started small and just kept fighting and fighting and fighting, and managed to pull together most of what had been Davidic and Solomonic Israel. So this is where the story of Hanukkah comes from, right? Purifying the temple, and of course Hanukkah is still celebrated. This was a very big event, but this is also a period where certain other ideas arise. One of them is martyrdom. So the book of Daniel, for example, is probably it's taking the story of Daniel, which goes back to the Babylonian exile, but it is retelling it in the context of this struggle. And so Daniel, like a lot of resistance literature, stands in for the people of that time resisting the Seleucids and the Hellenizers. So that's First and Second Maccabees is all about this rebellion and this fight. The concept of the resurrection of the faithful sort of appears at this point, and the earliest reference is Second Maccabees 7:14, when they're being tortured and martyred. One of them, so it says, when he was near death, he said, one cannot but choose to die at the hands of mortals and to cherish the hope God gives of being raised again by him. But for you, there will be no resurrection to life. So this is kind of the earliest reference about a resurrection, and it's specifically martyrs who will be resurrected to life. So you wonder, it's hard to make concrete connections between things, but I think about the image in Ezekiel of the bones in the valley, and that image is a metaphor for Israel, which has been destroyed and crushed and so on, will be revived and restored, right? The flesh will come on the bones, not literally, but figuratively. But here, it's almost like this is being taken from a group thing to an individual thing, and it's being literalized. And I think that's a lot of what begins to happen here, is this literalization of these mythological symbols. The other thing is apocalypticism, the battle between the sons of light and sons of darkness. We see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the War Scrolls specifically. War in the heavenly realms between good and evil. The Book of Enoch has fallen angels and the establishment of the 7 archangels and the corruption of humanity and the division of history into periods of spiritual conflict and so on. The Book of Enoch is probably the most influential book from this period that we don't have in most of our Bibles. It is in the Ethiopian Bible, and there is a Slavonic version, a shorter Slavonic version that's, I don't think it's actually in the Russian, Serbian, Bulgarian Orthodox Bibles, but there is a version of it in the Church Slavonic language. The Book of Enoch gets quoted in the Epistle of Titus. So there are references to it in early church writers. So it's out there. It's influential, and a lot of this imagery, like I say, the fallen angels and how demons started going out is can be found. The origins can be found in the Book of Enoch. So this period marches on, and of course comes to its next major transition with Herod and Rome. Herod was basically a usurper who made a deal with the Romans. He said, "You help me come to power. You help me get rid of these these Hasmoneans, and make me king of this kingdom. And we'll have a deal, and you'll have a foothold here, and I'll pay you tribute, and I get to build palaces and be rich." And so the Romans said, "Okay, that's good." So that's how Rome came into this area here. So this conflict with Hellenism continues. It's a time of great sectarian ferment. There are political tensions. There's xenophobia. There's the apocalypticism is reinvigorated, right? The hope for God to send a Messiah to restore Israel. Debates ensue. Is there resurrection or isn't there? Right? So just because somebody's talking about it doesn't mean it's real. And of course, there's Sadducees and the Pharisees. We hear this on certain Sundays, the lessons, this debate between the two of them is, I think this next Sunday is actually this lesson. Is there or isn't there a resurrection? Well, the Sadducees say, no, there isn't. And the Pharisees say, well, yes, there is. And Jesus ends up siding with the Pharisees. But the reason the Sadducees say, no, there isn't, is because the Sadducees, who are basically a priestly party, they use only the 5 books of Moses. They use only the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. They ignore the other stuff, the prophets and so on. And it's not in there. It doesn't say anything about it in there. And so for them, no, it's not a thing. But the Pharisees use a wider collection of books, and so they say, well, yes, there is. And then there's always the question of the status of the Samaritans who live up in here, who are the descendants of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And by this time, there are evil spirits everywhere, right? Possessing people. This is the cause of illness and so on. So if you look at the earlier texts in the Hebrew Scriptures, why has God, brought this illness upon me? The whole Job thing is taking that older theology. God has brought this illness upon me, and sort of turning it inside out a little bit. Yeah, kinda, but not directly, indirectly. So you can see, there's lots of kind of debate and discussion and so on, and that's what that's even modern Judaism is all about: debate and discussion. So Jesus, how does Jesus fit into that? Well, as I said, on the resurrection, he sides with the Pharisees. The reason I'm bringing up all this kind of resurrection stuff is because before there can be a hell, there has to be an afterlife. If there's no afterlife, then the only possible hell is the one we're living in right now. And so, so that's why this is important, because the whole idea of the afterlife is tied up with the idea of resurrection. So on the resurrection, Jesus sides with the Pharisees, yes. On demons, there are many demons, and Jesus casts them out. God is more powerful than the demons. On Satan, Satan, for the way Jesus talks about Satan, is still associated with the heavenly court. He says at one point, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. So Satan's not in some underground cave or something. Satan is up in the heavens, like in Job. On apocalypticism, Jesus sees the end, the judgment, and the restoration coming very soon, and the resurrection. And on afterlife, other than physical resurrection, Jesus is ambiguous, right? There's the story of the rich man and Lazarus. So again, we see these kind of ambiguous stories. And then his statement, God is the God of the living, not of the dead. But of course, he uses that as an argument for the resurrection, not for some kind of place that people are actually in. So Jesus isn't saying, oh yeah, the Greeks are right, there is a place where people go. It's just they're dead, and then God raises them, I guess, like the bones in Ezekiel. So, so anyway, it's ambiguous there, and again, Jesus isn't a theologian; he's a storyteller and a healer, and a proclaimer of God's grace and so on. So he's not there to be Plato, right? Anyway, and then on eternal punishment, again, Jesus is ambiguous. So he talks about Gehenna, which comes from the Hebrew Gai Hinnom, which means the Valley of Lamentation, which was the garbage dump, or became the garbage dump outside of Jerusalem. And it was believed at that time to have once been a Canaanite place of human sacrifice. And it's used as a metaphor. So Jesus says in Matthew 5:30, better for you to lose a member than for your whole body to go into Gehenna. So you can interpret this as implying some sort of place of punishment, but probably if you have Jesus in his context there, his cultural, intellectual context, it's more likely that he meant it simply as the garbage heap where your dead body gets thrown in the time of siege or pestilence, and he's using that as an image. So, for example, as a parallel example, in Matthew and Luke, he tells the story of, he talks about the time is coming when two will be together, sewing or weaving or whatever it is, and one will be left and the other taken. And modern evangelicals, usually interpret that as, the bad person gets left behind to be tribulated in the tribulation, and the good person gets taken up in the rapture. But that's not, if you read this whole section here, 24:36 to 44 and 17:22 to 36, it's clear that it's the good person who stays, and it's the bad person who gets swept away, or the person, not bad person, but the person who's not ready, who hasn't prepared themselves, gets swept away. And so it is still in that old way of thinking, that it all happens in this life, and God rewards and punishes in this life. So in the story of the rich man and Lazarus that we heard not too long ago, it presumes that there's some kind of a heavenly and hellish divide. So again, this raises some questions. Where did Jesus get this story from, or he made up this story? I mean, he could say, it's just a story. Don't make too much out of it. Is this a midrash, right? Jewish teachers use stories to explain complicated things, and they make stuff up that's not meant to be understood historically or literally or whatever. It's to make a point. So is this simply the midrash that because Jesus often talks about reversal, that because the rich man was rich and he enjoyed himself and he didn't help Lazarus in this life, then somehow in the judgment it'll get flipped around or something. It's one of those things to explore. But you can kind of see where later generations would take this and run a certain direction with it. So in the rest of the New Testament, basically, Paul assumes the imminent return of Christ, accompanied by resurrection of the dead and a final judgment. He doesn't give a lot of details about that, but the final end for the wicked seems to be the punishment of eternal destruction. So not being, which seems to mean not being granted eternal life, right? So not an eternal punishment, but it's just being ended, basically, being sort of snuffed out. There's no talk of hell or demons, and the other epistles echo similar ideas. Satan, devil are not to be feared because Christ is more powerful. And so, like in James, it says, submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. And the church's ministry is to heal, to cast out demons, and to restore. So at this point, we're not scared of Satan. We're not scared of demons and devils because Christ has been victorious over all these forces. So then finally, Revelation, just to finish up the biblical survey part of this here. So like the book of Enoch, it tells the story of the earthly battle between good and evil mirrored in the heavens, right? So that in Revelation, it goes back and forth between the heavenly scene and then what's happening on earth, and then the heavenly scene and then what's happening on earth. It's framed, Revelation is, its particular framing is in the context of persecution. Probably this vision was had or written down or composed during the time of the Roman Jewish War, which went from 66 to 72. It was a very calamitous time, a very tumultuous time, and a scary time. And it has martyrdom in it. It has the reward of eternal life for those who endure. So it kind of echoes the books of the Maccabees. And in Revelation, God, through the agency of angels, angeloi, so this is where our word comes from, which again means messenger, right? So evangelion, the good news, is the good message. Good. Angelion is message. And angelos is a messenger. So God, through the agency of these messengers, these angeloi, first binds and then destroys, quote, the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan. In the end, the enemies of the people, oh, I should have had another close quote there. In the end, the enemies of the people of God are destroyed, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night. So that's toward the end of Revelation. So while the people attacking, persecuting, killing God's faithful are destroyed, like in the battles and the calamities and so on, only Satan and the two key figures are punished forever, which again echoes that idea of Tartarus, where Sisyphus and Tantalus and Prometheus are sort of punished by the gods for eternity because they made the gods mad. So it's just those that have that. But we don't have a hell yet. It's just the lake of fire, and it's specifically for these three figures. So when we kind of start going through the centuries right after the New Testament, and you say, well, what did they pick up or what did they run with? It's interesting what they did and didn't run with at this point. So when the doctrines begin to be set down by official decree in the 4th century, there's no mention of hell. The emphasis is, and this is the end of the Nicene Creed, we look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. So it very much is, you die, you wait, you rise. That's kind of the image. And that's pretty consistent through these early church writings of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, 5th century, and so on. There's a lovely mosaic of the empty tomb there from that period. And I just want to read this to you. This is a good summary to because anyway, I'll just read this. This is from a book called The Roots of Christian Mysticism by a French Eastern Orthodox theologian named Olivier Clément. It's a really good book if you're into patristics. He says the early church had no conception of either of the present existence of souls definitely damned, nor an already consummated beatitude for the saints, nor again of a purgatory in the strictest sense, such as developed in the medieval West. What we find rather is the idea of a progressive purification and healing. After death, the soul crosses either a sea of fire or a spiritual frontier, where the powers of evil wrest from it what belongs to them and leave it stripped, ready to embark on a life of peace and silence. Thus, the sleep of death appears as a contemplative state. Death, undoing the tangles of idolatry and sin, offers the soul that peace, which spiritual persons know already here below, a blissful visitation from Christ, who is always present in hell. For since Holy Saturday and the Ascension, Christ is the fulfillment of all things. The Church does not forget that for the dead, fixed on their ignorance, greed, or pride, there are states in which the peace, the silence, the light, and the glimpse of the physician's presence are experienced as torments. But the Church, with all her love and all her power of intercession, prays for all the dead, including those who are in transitory hells. So you can see here the roots of purgatory, right, in this kind of early church idea. And this is still essentially where the Orthodox Church is at, right? The Orthodox Church kind of gets frozen in the 8th century, in the 700s, in the last ecumenical council. And its ideas are not, one of the critiques that the Orthodox Church has of the Western Church is that the Western Church tries to define everything. And the Orthodox theologians will say, but these things are mysteries of which we only catch glimpses. And so we, they will tend to stick with the metaphors and the poetry and the images and the liturgical language and let that be enough and not try to define it or measure it or so on and so forth. And so that's important for us in this exploration, because what they think of devil and hell and what we think of devil and hell are different things. So I have to do a quick little kind of history run through. So we need to understand, for Christian theology, the split between East and West. It's very profound. It's a cultural and theological split at many different levels. And it kind of begins here when Diocletian divided the Roman Empire into East and West. This is the predominantly Greek East. This is the predominantly Latin West. Just over 150 years after he did that, what we see is that the Greek East is pretty much intact still here, right? And the capital is in Constantinople. But the West has been taken over by these Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Bavarians, the Suevi, the Angles and Saxons. And so the West has fallen into chaos. So when we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, what we're really talking about is the Western Roman Empire being overrun by these Germanic tribes. But the eastern part of the Roman Empire stays intact. And that becomes important. So 100 years later, we see Emperor Justinian here, Constantinople, reconquering large sections. He reconquers Italy, he reconquers North Africa, and even southern Spain, and tries to bring them again into the Roman fold. This is also the time when Italy really goes into the Dark Ages, because Justinian's war in Italy is so destructive. It's kind of like, if you think about Ukraine now, you have these Roman armies, or these Byzantine armies, sometimes people call the Eastern Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire, tromping around trying to fight these Ostrogoths, and the Ostrogoths adopt a hit and run kind of thing. So the Romans come in, take a city, the Ostrogoths disappear into the hills, and they take a city somewhere else, and then they march that other city, and then they disappear into the hills and go to another city, and so on and so forth. And everything's destroyed, people die, pestilence, starvation, and this really is where we could say the Middle Ages comes to Italy, in this war. 200 years by 200 years later, it looks like this. The Islam has come out of Arabia, has conquered all these areas. The Eastern Roman Empire has managed to hang on to this here, Constantinople, the capital, but Italy has been overrun by another Germanic tribe, the Lombards, and so you can see that the Byzantines or the Romans are trying to hold on to Rome and these islands, and things are getting precarious there. And then if we go another 100 years ahead, it looks different again. And at this point, one of the tribes here, the Franks, have managed to kind of pull together a bit of an empire. And here's the Eastern Roman Empire still hanging on down here. And so the Pope at this point crowns this king as his own emperor. That's a whole other story we don't need to get into. But oh yes, and then leading up to the Crusades. So before the Crusades, the West was in retreat mode, was in chaos mode. Things were getting kind of worse and less civilized and more rural, like cities disappeared, and Rome at this point was basically a pile of ruins with a few thousand people living near St. Peter's Church, not the current huge St. Peter's Church, but the old, smaller, late Roman medieval St. Peter's Church, and so there's this whole experience, this whole sense of something is gone, something has disappeared. While over here, there's still this magnificent city, Constantinople, still has chariot races, still has classical learning and all this kind of stuff. So the Crusades are a turnaround when the West kind of comes out of its long decline and is rising, and basically, we could look at the Crusades as the first colonial project of Western Europe, foreshadowing what would happen a few centuries later. Anyway, so the contrasting sensibilities of West and East. First, the West is influenced more by Latin legalism, the Roman legal system, right? So things need to be defined. And if God is going to be judging us, it's got to be, we got to have some clear laws. We have to kind of be able to enumerate things, right? It's a more pessimistic worldview due to centuries of chaos. The world is going to hell, so to speak. And the West leans a lot on the writings of Augustine of Hippo, who wrote in Latin. And Augustine was the one who pushed the idea of the total fallenness or depravity of humankind, so a more pessimistic worldview. Although if you read The City of God, you'll see that most of the time he sounds more like the Greek fathers in the East, but every so often he moves off in his more sort of pessimistic direction. Whereas in the East, you have much more of this traditional Greek philosophical abstraction, the use of poetic metaphor. There's a more optimistic worldview due to this continued internal stability. So you saw that even though everything was falling around, there was this essential core area, which is what is now Turkey and Greece and into the Balkans, that remained stable. And basically, the Eastern Roman Empire became kind of a giant city state where you had Constantinople and then the hinterland, bringing the riches to the city, and it was also a trade center. They lean more on the writings of the Cappadocian fathers. Cappadocia is in the eastern part of what is now Turkey, and they're much more mystical, much more optimistic about human nature. Human nature is good but tarnished. The emphasis in the East is that we are made in the image of God, and that image is still there. It's basically good, but it's become a bit tarnished. And so what we need to do is work with the Holy Spirit and kind of polish it off. That's the idea. So it's a more kind of optimistic, positivistic view of what we're about in this world. So then what happens in the West, in this chaos period, when Italy is being smashed, when the Italian cities are being smashed to bits by this war, We have the fellow who becomes Pope Gregory the Great growing up and becoming a monk and trying to survive and trying to help others survive. And so when he becomes Pope at the very end of the 500s, in light of Constantinople's inability to protect Rome from the invading Lombards, he asserts secular power to govern and defend the city and the church. And here's where we see a patterns begin to develop that the Roman Church, that we see through the Middle Ages, the Roman Church moving into governing. Beyond that, he initiates the long process of centralizing power in the papacy. And here's how one historian describes him. His character strikes us as an ambiguous and enigmatic one. On the one hand, he was an able and determined administrator, a skilled and clever diplomat, a leader of the greatest sophistication and vision. But on the other hand, he appears in his writings as a superstitious and credulous monk, hostile to learning, crudely limited as a theologian, and excessively devoted to saints, miracles, and relics. And Gregory the Great, he's called the Great. He kind of sets the tone for the future of the church in the West. And so the split between East and West becomes about all kinds of stuff, not least of all that, Eastern theology is still kind of more fluid and mystical and philosophical, and Western theology becomes more a bit more legalistic and literalistic and nailing things down. So over the course of the 11th to 13th centuries, the concept of those being purified after death, so we read about that, went from a general idea to a specific identifiable process located in a specific place called purgatory. And this all arose out of that whole Crusades thing where the Pope issued a general indulgence to everyone who went on the crusade, and for all the murders and tortures and rapes and things that they did while they were fighting the infidels in the East. They would have all their sins forgiven because they were doing this great thing. That was the first indulgence, and then popes kept issuing more and more indulgences to encourage knights to go on the Crusades, and then they got spread to other things, and it became a way of raising money for the church. And so if you're gonna do it for the living, why can't you do it for the dead? And the next thing you know, we have to start quantifying how much you have to pay to get how much time off from your relatives who are in purgatory, and purgatory becomes a place. So once purgatory was located, hell also became more physical. So now you see, you begin to have this literalization. So if there's purgatory, well, there's obviously hell too. And again, you have those Greco-Roman precedents of, an underworld, a dark place, and so on. And now Satan and devils and demons who had previously tormented people on earth in this life become tormentors in the afterlife. And a lot of this is driven not by theologians, not by the church per se, but by poets, including Dante. But Dante was not alone. There were others who also wrote stories like this at the time of Dante. So he was writing within an existing genre of these kinds of poems about the afterlife. And then church visual artists, making frescoes and murals and so on and so forth, played a large role in beginning to shape the iconography. And as you shape the iconography, begin to shape the thinking. So here are two different images of Satan. The one on the left is a mosaic from around the year 500, and it's the oldest known portrayal of Satan, and Satan is the angel in blue. So at this point, 500, think back to that time. This is before the Germanic tribes have come and destroyed everything, but this is from the East anyway, I think. But Satan is still largely understood to be somehow part of the heavenly court, or an angel of the same status as Michael, and so on and so forth. And so they make him a different color, but otherwise he doesn't look that different. And of course, his role is to, deceive people and lead them astray, and so on and so forth. Fast forward ahead to Western Europe, to Catalonia in what is now Spain, and you have this fresco, and I don't know if you can see it, but this is the temptation in the wilderness, and it's kind of like different parts of the story being told in one picture. And so you see Jesus there. Jesus is in the black overgarment and the red undergarment, under robe, and next to him is Satan, a little bit faded here. The weather, the centuries have not been very kind on this picture here, but you can see he's got sort of bird kind of feet here, or lizard feet or something, and he's clearly not really human anymore. And here he is again. Here he's got horns and a pointy nose, and this kind of bird feet thing. He's still got wings there. And here's the Archangel Michael, coming and ministering to Jesus at the end. So you can see how in these centuries, how the picture has changed. And it's not because a pope said, this is what he looks like now. It's because artists in the West began to make the devil look, well, I don't know if they were thinking of the serpent. This isn't particularly serpentish, but is that what they were thinking about? Or were there, if you think about the Celtic and Germanic images of mythological creatures and so on and so forth that were available to Westerners, people living in the West, did they kind of copy it from that? We don't know. I mean, all those things are worthy of extensive studies. That's a good dissertation for someone to write. Here's image of hell. This is Giotto di Bondone, who died in 1337. He's got the Last Judgment here. So you can see there's like Satan now is like this horrible monster, and all the damned are going down here. We begin to see all this nakedness happening. And then here's the heavenly host, and these are the patriarchs, and Jesus and Mary and the apostles, I guess. And there's Jesus, and then here's the saints, the saved, are on this side. So again, it's the artist using his fantasy to, as he understands it, decorate this church. And so you can imagine, I mean, this is in a church. And so everyone who comes and worships at this church says, oh, that's what it looks like. That's obviously what it's like, because that's what they put on the wall of the church. And then that happens for generations and generations down to our own time. Here's Hieronymus Bosch, the Day of Judgment. This is a little hard to see, but here's the Garden of Eden. Here's, I think, the sinful world today, or just before the judgment. And here's hell. And there's all kinds of horrible things happening here, and it's kind of this dystopian vision. Of course, his whole thing is always dystopian, but he's an artist for our time. So you see, how artists played a big role in shaping these images and stuff. So, going back to that difference between East and West here, here's the same quote unquote icon. This is actually up in the dome of a church, or in the semi-dome, side dome of a church, in Istanbul, Constantinople. This is the Kora Church that was built in the 1300s, and has been a museum until recently, and I think it's being turned back into a mosque or something. But anyway, has all these great Byzantine frescoes in it. And here's a picture of the same thing called the Harrowing of Hell. And it's basically this image that comes from the East. When Jesus rose from the tomb, symbolically, he pulled Eve and Adam out of the tomb. And so symbolically, he pulls all of humanity out of the tomb. That's very Eastern thinking. And here's some of the patriarchs and who are watching this happen. So this is the symbol. This is the icon that says this is the resurrection, because these are our parents, and it means all of humanity is pulled out of the tomb. Here, you can see the Western influence. Well, you can see it's a Western picture. There's Jesus, and he's raising, I guess, Adam out of the tomb, but now we've got devils here and creepy things, and it's like a movie. Will he make it? Will he succeed? it's that kind of a scene. And so you can see that the very different flavor of the two, and how one of the reasons I want to kind of point all this out is to say that our ideas about the devil and Satan and hell and all that are not universal ideas in Christianity. They're particular to the Western tradition, and I think they evolved because of the particular circumstances of the West. And it's just worth thinking about those things. So I'm going to end with some modern secular images of Satan and hell, because of course it's not just used in religion, it's used in entertainment, in music, in all kinds of places here. This is one of my favorite movies. Aiden and I both love this movie. This is called This Is the End, with Seth Rogen and his gang here, different people. Has any I say, raise your hand, does anyone see this? Anyway, it's hilarious. It's Seth Rogen, so it's kind of crude and so on and so forth, but it's a wonderful portrayal of the judgment and hell and all that kind of stuff in a lighthearted way. And here's Satan coming at the end to destroy everything, and that's a beam where Seth and his friend are being rescued by heaven because they sacrificed themselves for someone else. And here's Time Bandits, one of my favorite movies of all time. And so this is the place of utter darkness, I think it's called. That's the castle, fortress, the fortress of ultimate darkness. That's it, where evil lives. This is evil, and these are two of his minions here, in plastic things. What I like about Time Bandits is the subtext is that the devil and evil is industry and technology and so on and so forth. So and consumerism. So anyway, you'll have to see it sometime, but that's it.